The dust-choked sky blazed crimson as Florence Prescott stumbled through the canyon, her once fine blue dress torn and bloodied, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. 3 days on the run had left her feet blistered raw and her spirit nearly broken. Behind her, the distant thunder of hoofbeats grew closer with each passing moment. Whitaker's men, hunting her like an animal since she'd witnessed their massacre at Copper Creek. "I can't," she gasped, collapsing against the rough sandstone wall. "I just can't go any further." The sound of a rifle being cocked froze her in place. Florence turned slowly, expecting to face one of her pursuers. Instead, a tall figure emerged from behind a boulder, silhouetted against the dying sun. His weathered Stetson cast shadows across features hardened by years under the merciless western sky. "Madam," he said simply, lowering his Winchester, "you look like you've seen better days." Florence tensed, ready to flee despite her exhaustion. "Are you with Whitaker?" The stranger's eyes narrowed. "Judge Whitaker, that snake," he spat into the dust. "No, madam, name's Blake Vaughn. I've got no love for the judge or his hired guns." As if on cue, the distant hoofbeats grew louder, echoing through the canyon walls. Blake's expression darkened. "Those would be his men, I reckon." "They'll kill me," Florence whispered, the terror of the past days flooding back. "I'm the only witness." "Not today they won't," Blake said, taking her arm. "Come on." He led her quickly through a narrow passage in the rock wall that she hadn't noticed. The small opening widened into a sheltered alcove where a dun-colored horse was tethered beside a small campfire. "We need to move," Blake said, already gathering his meager supplies. Florence took a step forward and stumbled, her legs finally giving out. "I'm too tired to run," she said, her voice breaking. The cowboy paused, studying her face in the fading light. Something in his expression softened. "Then rest. I'll keep watch tonight." Florence wanted to protest, to insist they keep moving, but her body betrayed her. She sank to the ground, her eyelids heavy as stone. "Thank you," she managed to whisper before darkness claimed her. Blake crouched beside her, gently placing his worn leather coat over her shoulders. "We'll figure this out come morning, madam," he said softly, though she was already asleep. "That's a promise." He moved to the entrance of their small sanctuary, rifle across his lap as night descended over the New Mexico territory. The year was 1878, and the land was as untamed as the men who sought to claim it. Blake Vaughn had seen his share of trouble in his 30 years, but something told him the woman sleeping behind him would bring more than most. The riders passed in the night, their torches casting eerie shadows against the canyon walls. Blake remained motionless, his breathing slow and controlled, one hand on his rifle. They would be back at first light, he knew. Men like Whitaker's bunch didn't give up easily. When dawn broke, Florence awoke with a start, momentarily confused by her surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back, and she sat up quickly, wincing at the pain in her battered body. Blake was crouched by a small fire, coffee brewing in a battered tin pot. "Morning," he said without turning. "Figured you could use this." Florence accepted the tin cup he offered, the warmth seeping into her trembling hands. "They're still looking for me, aren't they?" "Yes, madam, they are." Blake settled across from her, his blue eyes studying her face. "Mind telling me what you saw that's got Judge Whitaker's men hunting you across 3 counties?" Florence stared into her cup, the memories threatening to overwhelm her. "I was traveling to Silver Creek to take a position as the new schoolteacher." The stagecoach stopped at Copper Creek Station for fresh horses. She paused, her voice growing softer. "That's when they came. Whitaker and his men. They weren't after the passengers, they wanted something the station master had, papers of some kind." Blake nodded. "And?" "The station master refused to hand them over, so they killed everyone, the driver, the other passengers, everyone except me." Florence looked up, her eyes haunted. "I hid under the coach. When they left, I ran. How long ago was this?" 3 days. I've been running ever since." Blake's expression hardened. "And they've been chasing you ever since?" "Whitaker saw me as they were riding away." Florence's hands trembled, spilling coffee on her tattered dress. "He looked right at me and smiled. That's when I knew I had to run." Blake took the cup from her shaking hands and set it aside. "You've been mighty brave, Miss Prescott, Florence Prescott, Miss Prescott, but you can't outrun them forever." "I don't have a choice," Florence said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's always a choice." Blake stood, moving to check on his horse. "We need to get moving soon. They'll be back." Florence asked, surprise evident in her voice. Blake turned, the morning sun highlighting the weathered lines of his face. "I'm not in the habit of leaving folks to die, Miss Prescott. Especially not ladies being hunted by the likes of Whitaker." "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Blake replied. "I know Whitaker's been squeezing this territory dry for years. I know good folks have a way of disappearing when they cross him, and I know you're in trouble." He paused. "Besides, I was heading to Silver Creek myself. Got some unfinished business there." Florence studied him carefully. Everything she'd ever learned told her not to trust a stranger, especially not in this wild country. But something in Blake Vaughn's steady gaze told her he might be her only chance. "Thank you, Mr. Vaughn." "Blake," he corrected, offering her a hand up. "We'd best be on familiar terms if we're going to be traveling together." "Blake," she repeated, accepting his help. They packed quickly, Blake insisting Florence ride while he led the horse on foot. They kept to the rough country, avoiding the main trails where Whitaker's men would be watching. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. Blake finally called a halt in a small grove of cottonwoods beside a trickling stream. "We'll rest here for an hour," he said, helping Florence down. "Horse needs water and so do we." Florence splashed cool water on her face, feeling some of the grime and exhaustion wash away. When she turned, she found Blake watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he said quickly. "Just thinking you look more like a schoolteacher now and less like someone who's been running for her life." Florence attempted a smile. "Is that a compliment, Mr. Vaughn?" "Blake," he reminded her. "And yes, I suppose it is." They shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Florence found herself studying her unlikely protector. His clothes were worn but clean, his manner reserved but not unfriendly. The gun at his hip looked well used, as did the rifle he kept close at hand. "You're not just a cowboy, are you?" she asked finally. Blake glanced up, surprised. "What makes you say that?" "The way you move, the way you watch everything. You're too careful." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Observant, aren't you? I was a Texas Ranger once upon a time, and now I'm just a man trying to find a bit of peace." His expression clouded. "Hasn't been easy these past few years." Before Florence could ask more, Blake stiffened, his hand moving to his rifle. "Someone's coming." They quickly gathered their belongings, but before they could mount, two riders appeared at the edge of the grove. Florence felt her heart sink. One of them she recognized immediately, a tall, lean man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, one of Whitaker's men. Well," the scarred man drawled, his hand resting on his holstered pistol. "Look what we found, Davis, the schoolteacher and a friend." The second man, heavyset with a bushy beard, grinned unpleasantly. "Judge will be mighty pleased we found her." Blake stepped forward, positioning himself between Florence and the riders. "Afternoon, gentlemen. Something I can help you with?" "Step aside, mister," the scarred man said. "Our business is with the lady." "I'm afraid the lady's with me now," Blake replied, his voice calm but unyielding, "and we'll be on our way." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "Do you know who you're dealing with?" "I reckon I do. You boys ride for Judge Whitaker." Blake's stance remained casual, but Florence noticed his right hand had drifted closer to his holster. "I also reckon you murdered a stagecoach full of innocent folks at Copper Creek Station." The men exchanged glances. "You'd be smart to walk away," the bearded man warned. "Never been accused of being smart," Blake replied with a tight smile, "but I am loyal to my friends." The scarred man's hand twitched toward his gun. Blake's draw was lightning fast, his shot dropping the man before he could clear his holster. The bearded rider managed to fire once, the bullet whining past Blake's ear before Blake's second shot caught him in the chest. The sudden violence left Florence frozen in shock. Blake quickly checked both men, confirming they were dead before returning to her side. "We need to move," he said urgently. "Those shots will bring others." Florence nodded numbly, allowing Blake to lift her onto the horse before he swung up behind her. They rode hard for the remainder of the day, putting as much distance between themselves and the cottonwood grove as possible. As dusk fell, Blake finally slowed their pace, guiding the horse into a secluded box canyon. The poor beast was lathered with sweat, its sides heaving from the exertion. "We'll stop here for the night," Blake said, dismounting and helping Florence down. "Can't risk pushing him further." Florence moved woodenly, helping to set up camp while Blake tended to the horse. When he finally joined her by the small fire, she spoke. "You killed those men." It wasn't a question, but Blake answered anyway. "Yes," without hesitation. Blake met her gaze steadily. "They would have killed you, Florence, and probably me too." "I know," she whispered. "It's just, I've never seen someone die before, not up close, not at Copper Creek, and not today." Blake's expression softened. "It's not something anyone should have to see." He paused. "I'm sorry you had to." Florence wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire. "What happens now? Whitaker has men all over the territory. We can't run forever." "No, we can't," Blake agreed, "but I have a friend in Redemption about 2 days' ride from here. He used to be a U.S. Marshal. If anyone can help us get evidence against Whitaker, it's him." "Evidence? What do you mean?" Blake poked at the fire with a stick. "Whitaker's been buying up land all over the territory. Some say he's been forcing people out, burning homesteads, poisoning wells. But no one's been able to prove anything. And you think the station master at Copper Creek had proof? I think he had something Whitaker wanted badly enough to kill for." Blake looked up at her. "And I think you might be the key to bringing him down." Florence shook her head. "I'm just a school teacher." "You're a witness," Blake countered. "Maybe the only one who's ever survived to tell the tale." They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the stars emerged overhead. Despite her exhaustion, Florence found sleep elusive. "Blake," she finally whispered. "Thank you for saving my life, for all of this." In the flickering firelight, she thought she saw him smile. "Get some rest, Florence. I'll keep watch tonight." Next morning dawned clear and cool. They set out early, keeping to the roughest country where Whitaker's men would have trouble following. Blake proved to be a skilled guide, finding game trails and hidden passes that Florence would never have noticed. As they rode, Florence found herself studying the back of Blake's broad shoulders, the way he sat easy in the saddle, alert to every sound and movement around them. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that she hadn't expected to find in a man who could kill so efficiently. "How did you become a Texas Ranger?" she asked as they stopped to rest the horse at midday. Blake glanced at her, surprise evident in his blue eyes. "That's a long story. We have time," Florence pointed out. He smiled slightly. "Fair enough." Blake settled against a rock, his rifle across his knees. "I grew up in East Texas. My pa was a blacksmith, taught me the trade. I was planning to follow in his footsteps until the war came." "You fought in the Civil War," Blake nodded. "Confederate Army. I was just a boy, really. 17 when I enlisted, 19 when it ended." His expression darkened. "Saw things no boy should see, did things I'm not proud of." Florence remained silent, letting him continue at his own pace. "After the war, I drifted west, did some cattle driving, some hunting. Then one day I helped a ranger track down a gang that had robbed a bank in Dallas. He said I had a knack for it, suggested I join up." Blake shrugged. "Seemed like a way to do some good. How long were you a ranger?" 8 years, until Cottonwood Creek." Florence sensed they were approaching dangerous ground. "What happened there?" Blake's eyes grew distant. "We were tracking a gang, the Sutton brothers, vicious men. They'd hit a settlement near the Red River, killed a family." His voice grew tight. "We caught up to them at Cottonwood Creek. There was a shootout. My partner, Sam Miller, was killed. So was a young girl who got caught in the crossfire." "I'm sorry," Florence said softly. Blake's jaw worked. "The captain said it wasn't my fault, said the Suttons were to blame. But I was the one who pushed for the confrontation instead of waiting for reinforcements." He met her gaze. "I couldn't wear the badge after that." Florence reached out impulsively, covering his hand with hers. "You were trying to stop dangerous men, just like now." Blake asked with a hint of bitterness. "Yes," she said firmly, "just like now." They rode on in companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. As the sun began to set, Blake guided them to a shallow cave set high in a bluff overlooking a vast expanse of scrubland. "We'll be able to see anyone coming for miles," he explained as they made camp. Florence nodded, wincing as she dismounted. Days in the saddle had left her muscles aching and stiff. Blake noticed her discomfort. "We should reach Redemption by tomorrow evening. You can have a proper bath and a real bed." "That sounds like heaven," Florence admitted, trying to massage a cramp from her calf. Blake busied himself building a small, smokeless fire while Florence prepared their meager supper. As they ate, Florence found herself wondering about the man beside her. "You mentioned unfinished business in Silver Creek," she said. "What kind of business?" Blake hesitated. "Personal business." "I've told you my story," Florence reminded him gently. He sighed, setting aside his tin plate. "There's a man there, Edward Carver. He was the one who hired the Sutton brothers for the job that got my partner killed." Blake's eyes hardened. "He's been running from justice ever since. I got word he's in Silver Creek now, working for Whitaker." Florence felt a chill. "You're going after him." "I'm going to see justice done," Blake corrected. "The legal way, if possible, and if not." Blake didn't answer, but his expression told her everything she needed to know. "What about after?" Florence asked. "After Whitaker and Carver are dealt with." "Haven't thought that far ahead," Blake admitted. "Never been much good at planning for the future." "Everyone needs a future to work toward," Florence said softly. Blake studied her face in the firelight. "What about you? What's your future, Florence Prescott?" "I was going to teach school in Silver Creek," she replied with a sad smile. "Now I don't know. I can't go back there, not with Whitaker's influence." "There are other towns," Blake suggested. "Other schools." "Yes, I suppose there are." Florence looked out over the darkening landscape. "I always wanted a little house with a garden. Books on the shelves, children to teach," she laughed softly. "Simple dreams. The best kind," Blake said, his voice gentle. Their eyes met across the fire, and Florence felt a sudden warmth that had nothing to do with the flames between them. Blake looked away first, clearing his throat. "You should get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Florence nodded, settling down on her bedroll. "Good night, Blake." "Good night, Florence," he replied, his gaze returning to the vast, star-filled sky. Morning came with a chill wind blowing from the north. They packed quickly and set out, Blake pushing the pace faster than the day before. "Storm coming," he explained, nodding toward the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "We need to reach Redemption before it hits." They rode hard, stopping only briefly to rest the horse. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Blake's expression grew increasingly concerned as he studied the sky. "We're not going to make it before the storm," he finally admitted. "But there's an old line shack about an hour from here. We can take shelter there." The first fat raindrops began to fall as they spotted the small structure nestled against a rocky outcrop. By the time they reached it, the rain was coming down in sheets, driven by a howling wind. Blake dismounted quickly, leading the horse to a lean-to attached to the shack while Florence hurried inside. The interior was dusty but dry, furnished with a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot. A small iron stove stood in one corner. Blake joined her moments later, water streaming from his hat and coat. "Horses settled," he said, removing his dripping hat. "This storm looks to be settling in for the night." Florence nodded, trying not to show her disappointment. Another delay meant another day of danger. Blake moved to the stove, examining it. "Chimney looks clear. There's some wood stacked out back under cover. We might as well make ourselves comfortable." Soon a small fire was crackling in the stove, taking the damp chill from the air. Blake had brought in their supplies, including a cloth-wrapped package he set carefully on the table. "What's that?" Florence asked, curious. "Something I've been saving," Blake replied with a hint of a smile. "Thought tonight might be a good time for it." He unwrapped the package to reveal a can of peaches, a luxury out here in the wilderness. Florence's eyes widened. "Where did you get those?" "Traded for them back in Tucson," Blake explained, using his knife to open the can. "Figured they might come in handy someday." They shared the sweet fruit, passing the can back and forth, the simple pleasure somehow magnified by their circumstances. Outside, the storm raged, rain lashing against the small windows, but inside the shack, Florence felt oddly safe. "Tell me about your family," Blake said as they sat by the stove. "You haven't mentioned them." Florence's smile faded slightly. "There's not much to tell. My father was a banker in St. Louis. He died when I was 16. Mother passed 2 years later." "I'm sorry," Blake said softly. Florence shrugged. "It was a long time ago. After Mother died, I went to live with my aunt in Denver. She's the one who encouraged me to become a teacher." Her expression brightened. "She's quite remarkable, actually, runs a boarding house for young ladies and teaches music." "And she approved of you coming out here alone." "Not exactly," Florence admitted with a small laugh. "She wanted me to teach in Denver, but I wanted adventure, to see something of the world before settling down." "Well, you certainly found adventure," Blake observed dryly. "Not quite what I had in mind," Florence agreed. The firelight cast dancing shadows across her face as she turned to look at him. "What about your family?" Blake was quiet for a long moment. "My mother died when I was young. My father raised me and my brother on his own." "You have a brother." "Had," Blake corrected. "Thomas died at Shiloh. I was there, but not with him, different regiments. And your father, still alive, last I heard. He remarried after the war, moved to California." Blake's voice was matter-of-fact, but Florence sensed old pain beneath his words. "You don't see him. We disagreed about some things after the war." Blake stared into the fire. "I write to him sometimes. He doesn't always write back." Florence wanted to reach out to him but hesitated. Instead, she said, "Family can be complicated." Blake nodded, still watching the flames. "That it can." The storm continued throughout the night, the wind moaning around the corners of the shack. Blake insisted Florence take the cot while he made do with his bedroll on the floor. Despite the cramped quarters, she felt safe with him nearby, his steady presence a comfort in the darkness. Florence awoke to pale sunlight streaming through the dusty windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, clean world. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, then remembered where she was. Blake was already awake, stoking the fire in the stove. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Storm's blown itself out. We can reach redemption by midday if we start soon." Florence nodded, finger combing her tangled hair. "I'm ready whenever you are." They ate a quick breakfast and set out under clear skies. The land was transformed by the rain, desert wildflowers already beginning to unfurl their petals in response to the moisture. "It's beautiful," Florence remarked as they rode across a meadow carpeted with tiny purple blossoms. "It can be," Blake agreed. "The territory has its moments." They crested a rise around noon, and Blake reined in, pointing to a collection of buildings nestled in the valley below. "Redemption," he said. "Not much to look at, but it's safer than most places around here." The town was indeed small, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising at one end, a livery stable at the other. As they rode down the rutted street, Florence noticed curious glances from the townspeople they passed. Blake guided them to a whitewashed building with a sign proclaiming it Sullivan's General Store and Post Office. He dismounted and helped Florence down. "Daniel Sullivan's an old friend," he explained. "Served as a U.S. Marshal for 15 years before settling here. If anyone can help us, it's him." The bell over the door jangled as they entered. A tall man with iron gray hair and shrewd eyes looked up from behind the counter, his weathered face breaking into a smile of recognition. "Blake Vaughn, as I live and breathe," he said, coming around the counter to clasp Blake's hand. "It's been, 3 years?" 4, Blake corrected with a smile. "Good to see you, Daniel." The older man turned his attention to Florence. "And who might this lovely lady be?" "Florence Prescott," Blake replied. "She's in trouble, Daniel, the kind only you can help with." Sullivan's expression grew serious. "Judge Whitaker kind of trouble," Blake nodded. Sullivan sighed. "Let's talk in the back," he called to a young man stocking shelves. "Tom, mind the store for a spell." They followed Sullivan through a doorway into a comfortable living area behind the store. Once they were seated, Blake explained everything: the massacre at Copper Creek Station, Florence's flight, and the pursuit by Whitaker's men. Sullivan listened intently, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When Blake finished, he let out a long, low whistle. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest this time, Blake." "I know," Blake admitted. "But Miss Prescott here is the first witness to one of Whitaker's crimes who's lived to tell about it. This could be the chance we've been waiting for." Sullivan turned to Florence. "Did you actually see the judge at the station?" Florence nodded firmly. "I did. He was giving the orders." "He was the one who told them to kill everyone." "And you're certain it was Whitaker?" "I saw him at the stagecoach office in Santa Fe before we departed," Florence confirmed. "He was arguing with the agent about a land deed. I remember thinking how unpleasant he seemed." Sullivan rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Whitaker's been buying up land all through the territory. Word is the railroad's coming through and he knows which route it'll take." "So he's murdering people for their land?" Florence asked, horrified. "Wouldn't be the first time such a thing has happened," Sullivan replied grimly, "but proving it is another matter entirely." "What about the U.S. Marshal's office?" Blake asked. "Surely they'd investigate," Sullivan snorted. "Marshal Green is deep in Whitaker's pocket, has been for years." He paused, considering. "But there's a circuit judge due in Silver Creek next week. Judge Harmon, he's honest from everything I've heard. If we could get Miss Prescott to him." "Silver Creek," Florence's voice rose in alarm. "That's where Whitaker is strongest." "Exactly why he wouldn't expect us to go there," Blake said thoughtfully. Sullivan nodded. "It's risky, but if Judge Harmon hears your testimony, he could issue a warrant for Whitaker's arrest. Even Green would have to enforce that." "And in the meantime?" Florence asked. "Whitaker's men are still hunting me." "You'll stay here," Sullivan said decisively. "I've got a room upstairs you can use. Nobody will look for you in redemption." Blake nodded. "It's the best plan we have." "I'll head to Silver Creek alone, make contact with Judge Harmon when he arrives, then come back for you." Florence frowned. "No, I'm not letting you face this danger alone, Blake. We go together or not at all." Blake and Sullivan exchanged glances. "It would be safer for you here," Blake insisted. "Safer for me perhaps, but what about you?" Florence challenged. "You'd be walking into Whitaker's territory alone." "I can take care of myself." "And so can I," Florence replied firmly. "I've survived this long, haven't I? Besides, what if something happens to you?" "Who would believe my story then?" Sullivan chuckled. "She's got you there, Blake," Blake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, we'll go together, but not directly. We'll circle around, approach Silver Creek from the north where they won't be expecting us." "You can stay here for a few days," Sullivan offered. "Rest, get supplies. I'll send word to some friends I trust about Whitaker. Start building support." "Thank you, Daniel," Blake said sincerely. Sullivan waved away his thanks. "Just doing what's right." "Now Miss Prescott looks like she could use a hot bath and a decent meal. Martha will be back from her sister's soon. She'll help you get settled." Florence felt tears prick her eyes at the simple kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Call me Daniel," he insisted with a gentle smile. "Any friend of Blake's is a friend of mine." The next days in redemption were a welcome respite. Martha Sullivan, Daniel's wife, took Florence under her wing, providing her with clean clothes, home-cooked meals, and a motherly concern that Florence hadn't experienced in years. Blake spent much of his time with Daniel, planning their approach to Silver Creek and sending messages to potential allies. Florence saw little of him during the days, but each evening they would gather in the Sullivans' comfortable kitchen, sharing a meal and discussing the day's developments. On the third evening, after Martha had retired and Daniel was closing the store, Florence found Blake sitting alone on the back porch, staring up at the stars. "May I join you?" she asked. He glanced up, a smile warming his features. "Of course." Florence settled beside him on the wooden bench. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the small town. "Daniel says we'll leave for Silver Creek the day after tomorrow," Florence finally said. Blake nodded. "The circuit judge is expected there in 5 days. We need time to get into position." "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. Blake considered the question. Cautious, he decided, but not afraid, not for myself at least. "For me then," he turned to look at her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Yes, for you." Florence's heart quickened at the intensity in his blue eyes. "I'll be careful." This isn't your fight, Florence. You could still stay here. Let me handle Whitaker. It became my fight when I watched him murder innocent people, she replied firmly. I won't hide while you risk your life. Blake shook his head, a rueful smile playing on his lips. You are possibly the most stubborn woman I've ever met. I prefer to think of it as determined, Florence retorted, but she was smiling too. Blake chuckled, then grew serious again. When this is over, have you thought about what you'll do? Florence considered the question. I still want to teach, perhaps not in Silver Creek, but somewhere in the territory. There's a need for teachers in redemption, Blake observed casually. Daniel mentioned it yesterday, said the town's growing and the schoolmarm is getting married next month, moving to Denver with her husband. Florence felt a flutter of hope in her chest. Is that so? Blake's gaze returned to the stars. It's a good town, good people. And what about you? Florence asked softly. What will you do when this is over? Blake was quiet for a long moment. I've been drifting for a long time. Maybe it's time to stop. Here, in redemption, he turned to her again, something unspoken in his eyes. Maybe, if there was a reason to stay. Florence's breath caught. Before she could respond, the back door opened and Daniel stepped onto the porch. Sorry to interrupt, he said, though his knowing smile suggested he wasn't sorry at all. Just wanted to let you know I've got those maps you asked for, Blake. Blake cleared his throat, standing quickly. Thanks, Daniel. I'll take a look at them now. As he followed Daniel inside, he paused at the door, glancing back at Florence. Good night, Florence. Good night, Blake, she replied softly, her heart still racing from the moment that had passed between them. They left redemption before dawn 2 days later, well supplied and well rested. Daniel had provided them with detailed maps of the area around Silver Creek, marking the location of trusted friends who would offer shelter if needed. They traveled cautiously, keeping to little-used trails and avoiding settlements. Blake was more vigilant than ever, frequently scouting ahead and doubling back to ensure they weren't being followed. On the second day of their journey, they camped in a small canyon, its walls providing natural protection and concealing their fire from distant eyes. We'll reach Silver Creek by tomorrow evening, Blake said as they ate their supper. Judge Harmon should arrive the following day. Florence nodded, trying to quell the nervousness that had been growing with each mile they traveled toward Whitaker's stronghold. What if he doesn't believe me? She asked suddenly. What if it's just my word against Whitaker's? Daniel's been spreading the word, Blake reminded her, and I've sent messages to some people I trust. By now, others will have come forward with their own complaints against Whitaker. Your testimony is the key, but it won't stand alone. Florence nodded, not entirely reassured. And what about Edward Carver, your unfinished business? Blake's expression hardened slightly. Daniel says Carver is indeed working for Whitaker, head of security, they call it. Really, he's just Whitaker's chief thug. Will you kill him? Florence asked directly. Blake met her gaze steadily. I want justice, Florence. If that can come through the law, so much the better. But if he draws on me... He left the sentence unfinished. Florence nodded, understanding. I just don't want you to throw away your future for the sake of the past. Something softened in Blake's eyes. I'm beginning to see a future worth considering, he said quietly. Before Florence could respond, Blake tensed, his hand moving to his gun. Someone's coming, he whispered. They quickly doused the fire, moving into the shadows of the canyon wall. Blake positioned himself protectively in front of Florence, his rifle ready. The soft clop of hooves echoed through the canyon, followed by a low whistle that Blake seemed to recognize. His posture relaxed slightly. It's all right, he said. That's a friend. A rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon, silhouetted against the twilight sky. He approached cautiously, hands visible and away from his weapons. Blake Vaughn, the man called softly. Daniel Sullivan sent me. Blake stepped forward, lowering his rifle. Frank Miller, been a long time. The newcomer dismounted, approaching with a grin visible even in the gathering darkness. 5 years at least, not since that business in Tucson. Blake turned to Florence. Frank is one of the few honest deputies in the territory. We've worked together before. Frank removed his hat, revealing a shock of red hair as he nodded respectfully to Florence. Miss Prescott, Daniel sent word you were coming. Thought you might use some help getting into Silver Creek. "What's the situation there?" Blake asked. Frank's expression grew serious. "Bad. Whitaker knows you're heading his way. He's got men watching every road into town." "How did he know?" Florence asked, alarmed. "Man called Davis was found half dead near Cottonwood Grove," Frank explained. "He survived long enough to tell Whitaker about you too," Blake frowned. "I thought I killed Davis." "Nearly did," Frank confirmed, "but he was tough, dragged himself to a ranch, got help, died yesterday but not before talking." Blake cursed under his breath. "That changes things." "Not necessarily," Frank said. "I've got a plan to get you into town unnoticed." As they gathered around the rekindled fire, Frank outlined his idea. Judge Harmon would be arriving by stagecoach the following evening. Frank, as a deputy assigned to the circuit court, would be part of his escort. "The judge always travels with a trunk of law books," Frank explained. "I can arrange for you to be on the detail meeting the stage outside town. We'll create a diversion and you can slip into town with the judge's party." "And Miss Prescott?" Blake asked. Frank grinned. "That's where Martha Sullivan's contribution comes in handy." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle of clothing. "The circuit judge's clerk is bringing his wife this trip. You'll be her, traveling with the judge's party." Florence examined the fine traveling dress and bonnet. "Will this work? Whitaker's men will be watching for a woman with a cowboy," Frank said. "Not a respectable lady traveling with the circuit judge and his staff. You'll be hidden in plain sight." Blake nodded slowly. "It could work." "It has to work," Frank said grimly. "Whitaker's getting desperate. Word of what happened at Copper Creek is spreading. If Judge Harmon hears testimony, issues warrants." He shrugged. "Whitaker's finished and he knows it." They spent the rest of the evening refining the plan. Frank would ride ahead to make the necessary arrangements, while Blake and Florence would continue on a route that would bring them to the rendezvous point outside Silver Creek by the following afternoon. As Frank prepared to leave, he pulled Blake aside. Florence couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw Blake's expression darken before he nodded grimly. After Frank had gone, Florence approached Blake. "What did he tell you?" Blake hesitated before answering. "Carver's been put in charge of security for the judge's visit. He'll be at the stagecoach station when we arrive." "Is that a problem for the plan?" "No," Blake said. "Just a complication I'll have to deal with." Florence studied his face in the moonlight. "Blake, promise me you won't do anything reckless. Your life is worth more than revenge." Blake looked down at her, his expression softening. "When did you start caring so much about my future, Florence Prescott?" "When it started to matter to me," she admitted quietly. Blake reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The simple touch sent warmth spreading through her. "I promise," he said softly. "No unnecessary risks." Florence nodded, hoping he meant it. The following day passed in tense anticipation. They traveled steadily, reaching the rendezvous point, a stand of cottonwoods beside a small creek, by mid-afternoon. Frank was waiting with two other men he introduced as deputies loyal to Judge Harmon. Florence changed into the traveling dress behind a screen of blankets, the men rigged for privacy. The garment was finer than anything she'd worn in years, the blue silk rustling pleasantly as she moved. Martha Sullivan had even included a small jar of rose-scented cream, which Florence applied to her wind-chapped hands and face. When she emerged, she found Blake staring at her, an expression of wonder on his weathered face. "You look." He began, then faltered. "Like a proper lady again," she suggested with a small smile. "Beautiful," he finished simply. "You look beautiful, Florence." She felt herself blushing. "Thank you." Frank cleared his throat. "Judge's stage should be arriving at the way station in about an hour. We need to get into position." They rode to a small way station about 5 miles outside Silver Creek. Frank spoke briefly with the station master, who nodded and disappeared inside. When he returned, he was accompanied by a distinguished-looking older man with silver-streaked hair and keen dark eyes. "Judge Harmon," Frank said, introducing Blake and Florence. "These are the witnesses I told you about." The judge studied them both carefully. "Deputy Miller has informed me of your situation. If what you say is true, Miss Prescott, Judge Whitaker has much to answer for." "It's true, Your Honor," Florence assured him. "Every word," Judge Harmon nodded. "Then I look forward to hearing your formal testimony." For now, let us proceed with Deputy Miller's plan. My clerk's wife is indisposed in Santa Fe, so her absence from our party will not be remarked upon. You will travel as Mrs. Bennet under my protection. And Mr. Vaughn, Florence asked, will join my security detail, the judge replied. Though I understand he has some personal history with one of Whitaker's men. His sharp gaze turned to Blake. I require your assurance, sir, that you will not jeopardize our mission with any personal vendettas. Blake met the judge's eyes steadily. You have my word, Your Honor. Justice comes first. Judge Harmon studied him a moment longer, then nodded, apparently satisfied. Very well, the stage will be leaving shortly. Mrs. Bennet, he said, offering Florence his arm with old-fashioned courtesy, shall we? The journey to Silver Creek passed with excruciating slowness. Florence sat inside the coach with Judge Harmon and his clerk, a nervous young man named Bennet who kept casting anxious glances out the window. Blake rode with the security detail, keeping pace alongside the coach. As they approached the outskirts of Silver Creek, Florence's anxiety mounted. Through the coach window, she could see riders appearing on the hills overlooking the road. Whitaker's men, watching their approach. Judge Harmon noticed her tension. Courage, my dear, he said quietly. We're almost there. The stagecoach rolled into town just as dusk was falling. The main street was crowded with curious onlookers, eager to catch a glimpse of the circuit judge. As they pulled up before the Silver Creek Hotel, Florence saw a group of men waiting on the boardwalk. Whitaker and his associates, come to greet the judge. Her heart hammered in her chest as she recognized the tall, imposing figure of Judge Clayton Whitaker, his silver hair gleaming in the lamplight. Beside him stood a lean, hard-faced man with cold eyes that Florence instinctively knew must be Edward Carver. Judge Harmon descended from the coach first, then turned to assist Florence. As she stepped down, she kept her face partially hidden by her bonnet, though her hands trembled slightly on the judge's arm. Judge Harmon, Whitaker called, stepping forward with an expansive smile that didn't reach his eyes. Welcome to Silver Creek. We've been looking forward to your arrival. Judge Whitaker, Harmon acknowledged with a cool nod. Thank you for your welcome. Whitaker's gaze slid to Florence, curiosity evident in his expression. And who might this lovely lady be, Mrs. Bennet? Judge Harmon replied smoothly. My clerk's wife. She's traveling with us while recovering from a recent illness. Florence kept her eyes downcast, murmuring a polite greeting. She was acutely aware of Blake positioning himself nearby, his face partially hidden by the brim of his hat. You must all be tired from your journey, Whitaker said. We've arranged accommodations at the hotel. Perhaps you would join me for dinner once you've had a chance to refresh yourselves. Thank you, but Mrs. Bennet requires rest, Judge Harmon replied. Perhaps tomorrow. I understand we have a full docket to begin reviewing in the morning. Whitaker's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, tomorrow then. As they moved toward the hotel entrance, Florence felt Carver's eyes on her. She risked a glance up and found him staring not at her but at Blake, a flicker of recognition crossing his features. Blake met his gaze steadily, one hand resting casually near his holster. For a tense moment, Florence feared Carver would expose them, but he merely narrowed his eyes before turning away to speak to Whitaker. Once inside the hotel, Frank quickly ushered them upstairs to the rooms that had been reserved for the judge's party. That was close, he muttered once the door was closed behind them. Carver suspects something. He recognized me, Blake confirmed grimly, but he's not certain yet. Judge Harmon removed his coat, looking troubled. This complicates matters. If Whitaker suspects, we've brought witnesses against him. We need to move quickly, Blake said. Take Florence's testimony tonight, issue the warrants, and have Frank serve them before Whitaker can react. Judge Harmon considered this, then nodded. Very well. Miss Prescott, are you prepared to give your statement now? Florence straightened her shoulders. Yes, Your Honor, I've been prepared since the day it happened. The next hours passed in a blur as Florence recounted everything she had witnessed at Copper Creek Station. The judge's clerk recorded her statement while Judge Harmon asked occasional questions to clarify details. By the time they finished, it was past midnight. Judge Harmon read over the transcript carefully before signing it. This is sufficient to issue warrants for the arrest of Judge Clayton Whitaker and his associates on multiple counts of murder. He looked up at Frank. Deputy Miller, I'll have these ready by morning. I trust you can assemble enough men to serve them. Frank nodded. I have deputies I trust positioned throughout the town, Your Honor. Will be ready. What about Carver? Blake asked quietly. The judge fixed him with a stern look. Mr. Vaughn, I understand your personal interest in that man. But I must insist that all arrests be carried out according to the law. Of course, Your Honor, Blake agreed, though Florence noted the tension in his jaw. Judge Harmon sighed. Get some rest, all of you. Tomorrow will be challenging enough without adding exhaustion to our difficulties. As they prepared to separate for the night, Blake drew Florence aside. I don't like leaving you alone, he said in a low voice. I'll be fine, she assured him, though her own nerves were frayed. Frank has positioned a deputy outside my door, Blake nodded, still looking concerned. If anything happens, anything at all you call out, I'll be just down the hall. I will, she promised. Blake hesitated, then reached out to take her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. Florence, when this is over. Yes, she prompted when he fell silent. We should talk. About the future, her heart quickened. I'd like that. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Get some rest. I'll see you in the morning. Florence watched him go, her hand still tingling from his touch. Despite the danger that surrounded them, she felt a flutter of hope for what might lie beyond tomorrow. She slept fitfully, waking at every creak and footstep in the hallway outside. Dawn had barely broken when a soft knock at her door brought her fully alert. She rose quickly, wrapping a shawl around her nightdress. Who is it? She called softly. Frank, came the quiet reply. We have a problem. Florence opened the door to find the deputy looking grim, Blake standing behind him with a thunderous expression. What's happened? She asked, instantly alarmed. Whitaker knows, Blake said flatly. Someone talked, Frank nodded. The hotel clerk, he overheard enough last night to piece things together, went straight to Whitaker. Judge Harmon, still safe, Frank assured her. But Whitaker's men are gathering in town. They're blocking all the roads out. The warrants, Florence asked, signed, Frank said, but we're outnumbered. Whitaker's called in every gunman on his payroll. Blake stepped forward. You need to get dressed quickly. We're moving you and the judge to the marshal's office. It's the most defensible building in town. Florence nodded, trying to stay calm. Give me 5 minutes. She dressed hastily in the traveling outfit, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. When she emerged, Blake was waiting alone in the hallway, his expression taut with worry. Frank's gone to gather his deputies, he explained, offering her his arm. Judge Harmon and his clerk are already heading for the marshal's office through the back way. As they moved quickly down the hallway toward the back stairs, Florence asked, And Carver? Blake's expression darkened. Gone. Rode out of town at first light with a group of Whitaker's men. Frank thinks they're setting up an ambush on the road to Redemption in case we try to flee that way. They descended the stairs and slipped out through the hotel kitchen, startling a sleepy cook who was just beginning his morning preparations. Outside, the town was eerily quiet, the streets empty in the pale morning light. Something's wrong, Blake muttered, drawing his gun. There should be people about even this early. They moved cautiously toward the marshal's office, keeping to the shadows of the buildings. As they passed an alleyway, Blake suddenly stiffened, pushing Florence behind him. Well, came a cold voice from the shadows. Blake Vaughn. I thought that was you yesterday. Edward Carver stepped into the pale light, his gun already drawn. 2 more men appeared behind him, their weapons trained on Blake and Florence. Carver, Blake acknowledged, his own gun steady. Thought you'd left town, Carver smiled thinly. A necessary deception. Judge Whitaker suggested you might try to slip away with your witness. His cold gaze shifted to Florence. Though I must say she cleans up nicely, almost didn't recognize her from the description. The judge has already signed the warrants, Florence said, fighting to keep her voice steady. It's over, Carver chuckled. Warrants are just pieces of paper, madam. They only matter if someone's alive to serve them. Blake's finger tightened on the trigger. You won't get away with this, Carver, not this time. I got away with Cottonwood Creek, Carver replied with a cruel smile. I'll get away with this too. Drop your gun, Vaughn, or the lady dies first. Florence saw Blake hesitate, his eyes calculating. She knew he was fast, perhaps fast enough to take down Carver. But not all three men, not before one of them could shoot her. Don't do it, Blake, she whispered, Blake's jaw clenched. Slowly, he began to lower his weapon. A shot cracked through the morning air. For a terrifying moment, Florence thought Blake had been hit. Then one of Carver's men crumpled to the ground, clutching his chest. Drop it, Carver, Frank's voice rang out from behind them. You're surrounded, Carver whirled, firing blindly toward the voice. The second man turned as well, a fatal mistake. Blake's gun came up in a blur, his shot dropping the man where he stood. Carver fired again, the bullet splintering the wooden post near Florence's head. She ducked instinctively as more shots echoed through the street. When she looked up, Carver was on the ground, blood spreading across his chest. Blake stood over him, his gun still trained on the fallen man. It's over, Carver, Blake said quietly. For Cottonwood Creek, for Sam Miller, for all of it. Carver coughed, blood bubbling at his lips. You always were, too slow, Vaughn, he gasped. His eyes glazed over, staring sightlessly at the brightening sky. Frank approached cautiously, his rifle still ready. You all right? Blake nodded, holstering his gun. He turned to Florence, his eyes searching her face. Are you hurt? She shook her head, trying to control her trembling. No, I'm fine. Blake pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. Florence could feel his heart racing as fast as her own. I thought I'd lost you, he murmured against her hair. I'm still here, she whispered back, clinging to him. Frank cleared his throat. Hate to break this up, but we've got more trouble. Whitaker's barricaded himself in the courthouse with about a dozen men. He's demanding safe passage out of town in exchange for releasing the hostages. Hostages. Florence pulled back, alarmed. Frank nodded grimly. He grabbed some townspeople on his way there, women and children mostly. Blake's expression hardened. How many? 7 or 8. Judge Harmon's trying to negotiate, but Whitaker's not listening to reason. He knows he's finished, Blake said. Men like that are the most dangerous kind. Frank nodded in agreement. We need to get you two to safety, then figure out how to end this without bloodshed. They made their way cautiously to the marshal's office, where Judge Harmon was directing operations, his usual dignified manner unruffled despite the crisis. Miss Prescott, he acknowledged with relief as they entered. I'm glad to see you safe. What's the situation, Your Honor? Blake asked. The judge gestured to a rough map of the town spread across the desk. Whitaker has control of the courthouse here. He's demanding a wagon, supplies, and free passage to the territorial border. And if he doesn't get it, the judge's expression was grim. He's threatened to execute the hostages one by one. Florence felt sick. Those poor people. Do we know who he's holding? Blake asked, studying the map. One of the deputies spoke up. The banker's wife and daughter, the doctor's son, the blacksmith, a few others. Blake frowned. The blacksmith, Carl Weber, the deputy nodded. You know him. We served together during the war, Blake said. Good man, steady under pressure. An idea began to form in Florence's mind. If we could get a message to him. Blake looked at her sharply. What are you thinking? The courthouse has that trapdoor in the floor, she explained. I noticed it when I arrived in town, asked about it. The station master told me it was an old escape route from when the building was used as a trading post. Frank straightened. She's right. It leads to a tunnel that comes out behind the livery stable. If Weber knows about it, he might be able to help the hostages escape while we distract Whitaker, Blake suggested, catching Florence's train of thought. Judge Harmon considered the idea. It could work. But how do we get a message to Weber without alerting Whitaker? Mrs. Weber, Florence said suddenly. Is she among the hostages? The deputy shook his head. No, madam, she's at their home, worried sick about her husband. Then she could help, Florence insisted. If she has a way to signal him. Blake was already nodding. During the war, our unit used a whistle signal, 3 short, 2 long. If Weber hears that, he'll know someone's trying to reach him. Judge Harmon looked thoughtful. It's worth trying. Deputy, fetch Mrs. Weber here at once. Within the hour, they had formulated a plan. Mrs. Weber, a stout, determined woman with iron gray hair, would approach the courthouse under a flag of truce. ostensibly bringing water for the hostages. While there, she would use the whistle signal and convey their message to her husband. Meanwhile, Blake and Frank would position men at the tunnel exit behind the livery stable, ready to receive the hostages when they emerged. Once they were safely away, the deputies would surround the courthouse and force Whitaker's surrender. "It's risky," Judge Harmon acknowledged. "But I see no better option." Florence watched as Blake checked his weapons, her heart heavy with worry. "Be careful," she said softly when they had a moment alone. He looked up, his blue eyes gentle. "Always am." "That's not entirely true," she countered with a small smile. "I've seen you be reckless before." Blake's expression grew serious. "I have more reason to be careful now," he said quietly. "More reason to come back." Florence felt warmth spreading through her chest. "Blake." "When this is over," he said, his voice low and intense, "I want to talk about staying, in redemption, or wherever you decide to teach." Florence's breath caught. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to drift anymore, Florence." Blake took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. "Not unless you're drifting with me." Before she could respond, Frank called from the doorway. "Blake, it's time." Blake squeezed her hand once before releasing it. "Stay safe," he said. "I'll be back for you." Florence nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched him go, her heart a tumult of fear and hope. The next hours were the longest of Florence's life. She remained at the marshal's office with Judge Harmon and his clerk, receiving periodic updates from the deputies. Mrs. Weber had successfully delivered her message. The tunnel was clear. Blake and Frank were in position. When the shooting started, Florence jumped to her feet, her heart in her throat. Judge Harmon put a restraining hand on her arm. "Stay here, Miss Prescott," he said firmly. "You can do nothing to help out there." She knew he was right, but the waiting was unbearable. The gunfire continued, sporadic at first, then intensifying. Through the window, she could see people running for cover, smoke rising from the direction of the courthouse. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the door burst open. Frank stood there, his face streaked with soot, blood seeping from a graze on his arm. "It's over," he announced. "Whitaker's dead. His men have surrendered." "The hostages?" Florence asked anxiously. "All safe," Frank assured her. "Weber got them out through the tunnel just as planned." "And Blake?" Florence's voice trembled slightly. Frank's expression softened. "He's at the doctor's office. Took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll be fine." Florence was already moving toward the door. "Take me to him, please." The doctor's office was crowded with the wounded from both sides. Florence pushed her way through, searching frantically until she spotted Blake sitting on an examination table, his shirt off, the doctor wrapping a bandage around his shoulder. "Blake," she called, hurrying to his side. He looked up, his face lighting with a smile despite the pain evident in his eyes. "Florence," she reached for his hand, tears of relief spilling down her cheeks. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he assured her. "Bullet went clean through. Doc says I'll be sore for a while, but no lasting damage." The doctor snorted. "What I said was you're lucky to be alive, Vaughn. Another inch to the left and we wouldn't be having this conversation." Florence paled, but Blake squeezed her hand reassuringly. "See, lucky." The doctor finished the bandage and stepped back. "Keep it clean. Change the dressing twice a day, and try not to get shot again if you can help it." As the doctor moved on to his next patient, Florence helped Blake into a clean shirt that someone had provided. "What happened?" she asked as she carefully buttoned it for him, her fingers brushing against his chest. "Whitaker panicked when he realized the hostages were escaping," Blake explained. "Started firing wildly. One of his own men shot him in the confusion. After that, most of them gave up." He grimaced as he shifted position. "One didn't. Got a shot off at me before Frank took him down." Florence's hands stilled on his chest. "You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," Blake pointed out gently. "And it's over now, really over." She nodded, trying to compose herself. "Judge Harmon says we can return to redemption tomorrow once he's finished processing the prisoners." "Redemption," Blake repeated thoughtfully. "Seems fitting somehow." Florence met his gaze. "Did you mean what you said about staying?" Blake reached up with his good hand to touch her cheek. "Every word. If you'll have me, Florence Prescott, I'd like to stop running, find a home. With you." Florence covered his hand with her own, her heart so full she could barely speak. "I'd like that too," she whispered. "Very much." The journey back to redemption was slow but peaceful. Judge Harmon had arranged for a comfortable wagon, insisting that Blake needed to rest his injured shoulder. Florence rode beside him, the open road stretching before them like a promise. They arrived to a hero's welcome. News of Whitaker's defeat had preceded them, and the townspeople turned out to greet them, Martha Sullivan pushing through the crowd to envelop Florence in a warm embrace. "I knew you could do it," she declared proudly. "Both of you." Daniel clapped Blake carefully on his good shoulder. "About time someone brought Whitaker to justice. Glad it was you too." The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Florence. The town council offered her the position of schoolteacher, which she accepted with joy. Blake, still recovering from his wound, found work helping Daniel at the store while considering more permanent prospects. They courted properly, with chaperoned visits and Sunday walks after church. Blake proved to be a thoughtful suitor, bringing Florence wildflowers and books from Daniel's store. In the evenings, they would sit on the Sullivans' porch, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's hearts. One warm evening in late summer, Blake took Florence for a walk along the creek that gave the town its name. The setting sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, reflecting in the still waters. "I have something to show you," Blake said, leading her to a small rise overlooking the town. On the crest stood the framework of a house, its foundation solid, its beams reaching toward the sky. Florence gasped. "Blake, what is this?" He took her hand, a touch of nervousness in his smile. "It's going to be a house, our house, if you want it to be." "You're building a house?" Florence asked, stunned. "With some help from Weber and the other men," Blake admitted. "It's not much yet, but it will have 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen," and he smiled shyly, "shelves for all your books." Tears filled Florence's eyes as she took in the meaning of his words. "Are you asking?" Blake dropped to one knee before her, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing shoulder. From his pocket, he produced a simple gold ring. "Florence Prescott," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes, "I've been drifting all my life, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. But home isn't a place, it's a person, and you've become my home." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me?" Florence felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Blake Vaughn, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood to pull her into his arms. Their kiss was tender and full of promise, the first of many they would share in the years to come. They were married in Redemption's small church that autumn, with Daniel Sullivan giving the bride away and Frank Miller standing as best man. Judge Harmon himself returned to perform the ceremony, declaring it the happiest duty of his judicial career. Their house was finished before the first snow fell, its windows glowing with lamplight on dark evenings, its hearth warm and inviting. Blake found his place in the community, eventually becoming Redemption's sheriff when the position opened the following spring. Florence's school flourished under her care, her students adoring the teacher who told such exciting stories about justice and courage. On cool nights, they would sit on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the distant mountains. Sometimes they spoke of the past of Copper Creek Station and Silver Creek, of the dangers they had faced together. But mostly they talked of the future of their plans, their dreams, the family they hoped to build. 3 years after their wedding, Florence gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Sarah, after Blake's mother. 2 years later came Thomas, named for the brother Blake had lost at Shiloh. Both children grew strong and happy in the house on the hill, surrounded by love and stories of courage. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Blake took Florence back to the small canyon where he had first told her to rest while he kept watch. They made a picnic of it, watching their children play among the wildflowers that carpeted the ground. "Do you ever wonder," Florence asked as they sat side by side, "what would have happened if I hadn't stumbled into your camp that day?" Blake considered the question, watching Sarah show her little brother how to weave a crown of flowers. "I try not to think about it," he admitted. Can't imagine my life without you and the children. Florence leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his. I was so tired of running, she mused, so afraid. And I was tired of drifting, Blake replied, squeezing her fingers, so alone. They watched in comfortable silence as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls with golden light. Thank you, Florence said softly. Blake turned to look at her, a question in his eyes. For keeping watch that night, she explained with a smile. For giving me a reason to stop running. Blake brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. Thank you, he replied, for giving me a reason to stay. As the sun set over the New Mexico territory, Blake Vaughn held his wife close, watching their children play in the fading light. The badge on his vest caught the last rays of the sun, a symbol of the justice he had sought and the peace he had found. They had both been running, she from danger, he from the past. But on that fateful night when she had said, I'm too tired to run, and he had replied, then rest, I'll keep watch tonight, they had begun a journey neither had expected. A journey that had led them through danger and darkness to the light of a shared life, built on trust, courage, and love. And as they gathered their children and headed home to the house on the hill, both knew with absolute certainty that some journeys were worth every hardship, every risk, every moment of fear, because they led exactly where you were meant to be.